long before the gods had names, before kings were remembered in stone. There was only the silence of the Nile's banks. There, in the fertile cradle between the desert and the river, men and women learned to live in harmony with the cycles of the earth. Each year, the waters rose and fell like a deep breath of nature itself, covering the fields with the dark silt that would give their land its name, Kemet, the Black Land. The red desert around them, the Deshret, was the arid boundary between the known world and the unknown. And at the center, always the Nile, snaking like a divine vein, connecting the living to the dead, the north to the south, the present to the eternal. For countless generations, small villages spread out along the Nile Valley. Men hunted and gathered, then learned to plant. They domesticated wheat, shaped clay, carved wood, and gazing at the sky, they began to see order in the stars. Time for them was not a straight line, oh no, but a circle. Like the sun, which was reborn every morning in the east and died every night in the west. Like the river, which brought fertility at the right time, with the precision of a celestial clock. Like the body, which aged, died, and might perhaps be reborn in another world. And so was born a profound, serene, and cyclical worldview, a spirituality linked to the land, to the sky, to the water, and to the idea of continuity. Over time, villages became cities, tribal chiefs became lords, and in the two main regions of Egypt, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, in the delta where the Nile opens into many branches, kingdoms began to emerge. Two crowns, two peoples, two identities. A silent conflict hung in the air, the need for unification, not by conquest, but for balance. And it was in this setting that a nearly mythical figure emerged, shrouded in shadow and symbol. Narmer, or Menes, as he would later be remembered. He didn't just conquer, he united. He wore the two crowns, the white one of the south and the red one of the north, symbolizing the fusion of two worlds under one will. With his arrival, something new was born. Not just an empire, but an idea of organized eternity. He founded a capital where the worlds met, at this, perhaps at Memphis, and there he instituted something that had never before existed. A state, one people, one language, one administration, focused not only on the now, but on the forever. With the emergence of this first pharaoh, Egypt took its definitive step towards historical immortality. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was the link between men and the gods, the sustainer of order, the reflection of the sun on earth. His word was law, his death, ritual, his presence, sacred. And so, life began to revolve around the palace and the temple. Writing flourished, hieroglyphs, sacred images, to record prayers, decrees, stories. Papyrus became the skin of memory. Stone, the silent witness of time. Society structured itself like a mirror of the cosmos. At the top, the pharaoh. Below, the priests, the scribes, the artisans, the peasants, all connected in a chain of duties and beliefs. Everything had its place. Everything had its time. The cosmic order, or Ma'at, was the heart of the Egyptian world. Maintaining harmony was not just a desire, it was a divine obligation. Even the dead needed to be guided precisely through the afterlife, with rituals, amulets, and the right words, so they wouldn't get lost in eternity. In this first moment of unification, Egypt was not yet grand because of the pyramids, but because of the silence that precedes the monument. the whisper of the first prayers, the still wet clay of the first cities, the gleam of newly smelted copper in the workshops at dusk. It was an Egypt being born, full of possibilities, taking a deep breath before the infinite. Eternity was being drawn with patience. As night falls on the banks of the Nile, imagine these ancestral villages in silence. A lamp lit inside a mud brick house. A mother teaching her son the stories of the gods who created the world from mud and light. A scribe practicing his first signs on the rough surface of papyrus. The river outside, flowing calmly, as if it knew it was watching the beginning of something that would never be forgotten. Egypt had awakened. The first sun had risen over Kemet, and time, in that moment, began to have memory. After Egypt was unified under a single crown, time began to move differently, no longer just to the simple rhythm of the seasons or the cycle of the flood, but like a slower, deeper current, as if the world itself was learning to breathe more consciously. The union of Upper and Lower Egypt not only gave shape to a new state, but to an idea that order was possible, that chaos could be overcome, that man, with the favor of the gods, could imitate eternity. The capital was established where the south and north met. There, near the banks, where the river narrowed its passage between fertile lands, a city was built, not just of mud brick, but of purpose. Its temples were simple, but solid. Its houses were low, but aligned. It was a center of power that sought not only to govern, but to reflect the sky. Because for the Egyptians, governing was not a human act. It was a reflection of divine will. The pharaoh, now established as the intermediary between men and the gods, ruled not by force, but by function. He was Ma'at in human form, order made flesh, balance on earth. With internal peace consolidated, Egypt turned inward, not towards isolation, but towards deepening. The time other peoples spent on wars, the Egyptians dedicated to organization, agriculture, religion, and art. The fields flourished with golden grain, and the granaries filled with the result of the Nile's eternal cycle. Scribes spent their days in the shade, copying lists, contracts, names, and stories onto carefully smoothed papyrus rolls. In small workshops, artisans shaped amulets, carved stelae, and polished wood with a patience that only those who believe in eternity can have. Along the riverbanks, temples began to appear. They were still modest, made of wood and sun-dried bricks, but full of meaning. They were sacred spaces where the human voice rose in chants, where incense spiraled upward in fragrant curls, and where the invisible could be touched through ritual. The gods, many and yet one, made themselves present in every aspect of life. There were gods of the sky and the earth, of the river and the desert, of the harvest and of death. But all, in some way, turned towards the same center, the harmony of the world. As the decades passed, a new thought began to emerge in the heart of this civilization. If the pharaoh was a bridge between the visible and the invisible, then his existence could not end with death. Death, for the Egyptians, was not an end, but a crossing, a sacred moment when the being shed the earthly body to embark on a journey through spiritual realms. But for this crossing to occur safely, preparation was needed. Rituals, objects, texts, magic. The body had to be preserved, protected from the corruption of time. And so was born the practice that would become inseparable from the Egyptian soul. Mummification. The first royal tombs began to appear on the desert edges of the Nile, where the sun sets. They were rectangular structures with sloping walls, mastabas, as they would come to be called. Simple in appearance, but complex inside. Hidden tunnels and chambers guarded the pharaoh's body and the objects he would need in the afterlife: jewelry, weapons, furniture, perfumes, food, even small figurines of servants to help him in the beyond. Everything was prepared with reverence. Nothing was left to chance. The royal tombs grew larger, more elaborate, the walls thicker, the chambers deeper, the rituals more complex. And with this change came a new type of construction, solid, lasting, made to resist not just the desert sand, but oblivion itself. Stone began to be shaped. Large blocks, carved with precision, began to be stacked with superhuman patience. Mud and wood gave way to limestone and granite. It was as if the people of the Nile wanted, for the first time, to carve their existence into the very flesh of the world. And it was in this moment of transition that a new kind of man emerged: the wise architect. He didn't just design buildings. He understood the secrets of the cosmos. He knew where to place each pillar, where to open each chamber, where to let the light enter at the exact moment the sun touched the horizon. His constructions were not just for the eyes. They were for eternity, for the gods, for the afterlife, and also for those who would come after. Each reign passed like a beat in the great heart of Egypt. A new pharaoh ascended. The temples received new offerings. The fields were sown again. The statues received new names, and everything repeated. But not through empty repetition. It was constant renewal, like the cycle of life, like the river, like Egyptian time itself, which didn't move forward, but in sacred circles, while the people lived their routine in peace, working with their hands and dreaming of the afterlife. The rulers experimented with a new idea, that their memory could be preserved not only in the hearts of the living, but in stone. Name after name began to be carved on stelae, on walls, on altars. The name, for the Egyptians, was more than a word. It was an essence. Speaking it was to bring someone back. Forgetting it was to kill them forever. And so, writing became a gesture of constant resurrection. At dusk, when the sky turned golden over the desert, the river shone like a liquid blade. The first sacred singers chanted hymns in the small temples. Priests burned resins, anointed divine images with scented oils, and recited prayers inscribed on papyri, carefully hidden among the columns. Everything was done with rhythm, with precision, with devotion. Egypt was beginning to understand that it had found something rare: balance between the body and the soul, between the time of men and the time of the gods. And so, night after night, season after season, Egypt shaped itself like a slow sculpture that was in no hurry to finish. Each gesture was part of something greater. Each stone placed a word in a silent prayer. Each life lived, an offering to the eternal. There were still no immense monuments. Obelisks weren't yet etched against the sky. But the ideas that would make all of that possible were already present, like seeds dormant under the black earth. The people of the Nile had learned to live with death, to measure time by the stars, to dream of the afterlife as if it were just another step in life. And above all, they had learned to desire permanence, not just to be, but to remain. As the river flowed under the moonlight, and the winds glided through the freshly harvested fields, Egypt breathed serenely. Everything was in its place. The world made sense. Order was maintained. And in the stone foundations laid in the western deserts, a new era was preparing to be born. Time in Egypt did not pass. It rested. Between the current of the Nile and the desert hills, the days followed one another with the same precision as the cycles of the sun and the moon. The floods returned. The fields renewed themselves. Bread was baked in clay ovens at dusk. Ancient chants echoed in the small temples. And the dead, carefully prepared, slept under the sand, their names preserved in stone, wrapped in linen, and silence. Along the riverbanks, order was consolidated. The throne of the pharaohs had become the fixed axis of a world in balance. The people didn't just accept his existence, they orbited around it. The pharaoh was the point where the divine touched the earth. He was more than a king. He was the link between the sky and men, the guardian of cosmic harmony, the sustainer of Ma'at, the eternal truth. In the court, administration flourished. Scribes formed an elite of living memory, recording every transaction, every harvest, every prayer. Taxes collected from the peasants were stored in great royal granaries. There were records, inventories, lists of workers, offerings to the temples, codes of conduct, and everything necessary for Egypt to function as a single soul with many bodies. The organization wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Every function had a sacred purpose. The mason, carving a stone, wasn't just building a wall, but perpetuating order. The farmer, plowing the soil, participated in the symbolic rebirth of creation. The scribe, writing a name, gave it life. Egypt was a body. Every part moved with intention, and in the heart of this living organism, something new began to emerge. A silent but profound ambition. A desire not only to remember the dead, but to fix them in eternity in a way that was visible, touchable, indelible. Until then, kings were buried in great mastabas, rectangles of mud brick, with internal chambers and offerings. They were elaborate tombs, but still discreet, marked by respect and the fear of thieves. However, at some point, under the reign of a sovereign named Djoser, something changed. Djoser was not just any king. His name circulated with reverence among priests and advisors. There was in him an air of mystery and contemplation. He was a man who spoke little, but who listened to time. Under his rule, the court gained new vigor, and alongside him emerged a figure who would change Egypt forever. A man named Imhotep. Imhotep was not a warrior. He was not noble by birth. He was a man of knowledge, a scribe, an architect, a priest, a thinker. He spoke with the gods, but also knew the secrets of stones. He read the stars, but understood the weight of columns. To him was entrusted the most sacred task, to prepare the eternal house of Djoser. And it was on the sands of Saqqara that this project took shape. Far from the bustling banks of the river, in the deep silence of the desert, something never seen before began to rise. The first mastaba was built. But instead of completing the work, Imhotep ordered a second layer to be raised, and then a third, and a fourth. The structure grew like a staircase sculpted against the sky, a monument with 6 steps, solid, geometric, immense. It was the first pyramid in history. But it wasn't just a tomb. It was a declaration of eternity. Each block weighing hundreds of kilos, each alignment calculated to the millimeter. each chamber positioned with purpose. Around the pyramid, a vast sacred complex expanded. High walls like fortresses, ceremonial courtyards, colonnades carved in stone, offering rooms, narrow corridors, altars. Everything made for a king who, even after death, would continue to reign. The walls received inscriptions. Stelae were erected. Statues were carved with the serene features of the sovereign. The most famous of them, hidden in a dark chamber, showed Djoser seated, his eyes gazing into infinity, dressed in a cloak of millions of years. That image was not just art, it was a living presence. The ceremonies were many. At each new stage of the work, priests performed purifications. Amulets were buried in the foundations. The king himself participated in rituals to renew his life force. The pyramid was not just a funerary monument, but a portal between worlds, an axis of connection between the visible and invisible realms. The workers came from various parts of Egypt. They were not slaves, but men paid with bread, beer, fish, and honor. They divided themselves into teams. They slept in villages built near the construction site. There were doctors, cooks, artisans, accountants, organizers. The entire logistics of the work were managed with admirable precision. Imhotep, silent and attentive, supervised everything, not just the engineering, but also the celestial alignments, the sacred proportions, the hidden symbolisms. The pyramid was a text, a prayer in stone, an architecture of faith. As the structure grew, the people of the Nile watched it with reverence. It emerged on the horizon like a new sacred mountain, a concrete image of creation. In Egyptian tradition, the world had begun with a sudden elevation of land emerging from the primordial waters, the original mound where the first god manifested. Now, with the pyramid, man repeated that ancestral gesture. At dusk, when the sun set behind the sands and the pyramid cast long shadows across the plain, the priests lit incense, the smoke rose in spirals, and murmured chants echoed through the colonnades. It was as if the desert itself was learning to pray. In daily life, the pyramid was a topic in every home. Children drew its shape in the sand. Fishermen used it as a landmark. Merchants commented on its height, its stones, its shine in the sun. The people felt that what was being raised was not just for a king. It was for everyone, because in Egypt, the king did not die for himself alone. With him died the peace of the Nile, the stability of the seasons, the balance of the world. And so his tomb had to be perfect, because in it rested not only his body, but the destiny of the entire country. And so, stone by stone, the pyramid of Djoser became the first great monument of the human soul, shaped against time. When the pyramid of Djoser finally stood completed on the plain of Saqqara, it was not just a finished work. It was a new language, a new way for Egypt to understand itself, a definitive milestone that altered the landscape not only of the desert, but of thought. For the first time, men had built something that was neither house, nor temple, nor fortress. It was a sign for time, and time understood. The impact was profound, not only in the palaces, but in the villages, not only among the priests, but among the farmers who plowed the land with oxen. The pyramid became part of life, a constant shadow on the horizon, a reminder that the world of the living and the world of the dead were connected by something more than prayer, by stone. In the temples, rituals changed. Ceremonies now imitated the pathways carved into Djoser's funerary complex. The priests, formerly turned only to the gods, now also turned to the dead kings, who now seemed as close to the divine as the gods themselves. Offerings became more abundant, hymns more elaborate. Religious architecture began to mirror funerary architecture. The border between temple and tomb became more tenuous. The very notion of death altered. It was no longer enough to bury the body with care. It was necessary to orient it in space, to align its rest with the winds, with the stars, with the lines that connected earth to sky. The tomb came to be seen as a replica of the universe, with rooms for birth, corridors for the crossing, and chambers for rebirth. Funerary art flourished not out of vanity, but out of spiritual precision. Every relief, every symbol, every color, every hieroglyph was a sacred gesture, a spell carved in stone. And as Egypt observed this new landscape emerge, something deeper began to germinate. A growing confidence in the human capacity to participate in the eternal. The pyramid had not been raised by the gods. It had been built by men, with ropes, levers, calculations, discipline, and faith. What was once imagined only in myths, the staircase of ascension to the sky, the primordial mountain where the world was born, now existed under the sun and had been made by human hands. Imhotep became a legend in his own lifetime. His name was spoken with respect in the corridors of the court. Many said he knew the secrets of creation, others that he could cure diseases with words. For some, he was the only man who had conversed with the gods without intermediaries. The fact was that he had proven that thought, when guided by faith and order, could overcome the passage of time. The reign of Djoser ended like that of all kings, with the silence of death. But his body did not rest under the sand. It was sealed in the depths of his pyramid, protected by layers of stone, surrounded by sacred formulas and carefully positioned objects. His soul, it was believed, had ascended the invisible steps to join the imperishable stars of the north, those that never set, that eternally rotate in the firmament, that guide travelers and the dead. And this image gained strength. The pyramid became more than a tomb. It became a point of access to the cosmos. Its stepped form was interpreted as a divine staircase. The steps, symbols of the soul's elevation. The base, the world of men. The top, the realm of the deities. Between them, the journey of the king. And with him, the hope of all who lived under his shadow. The death of the king was never just a loss. It was a moment of cosmic transition. The throne passed to another, yes. But the previous king continued present, not as memory, but as active spiritual power, involved in the cycles of fertility, of the sun, of justice. And so, tombs became more complex, richer, taller, more visible. Because now, they didn't just guard, they proclaimed. And at Saqqara, the pyramid of Djoser was just the beginning. Other nobles and high officials began to want to be buried there, close to the king. The necropolis grew. The mastabas multiplied. The funerary architecture of the elite began to imitate, in miniature, what had been done for the king. It was clear. The path to eternity passed through stone. But raising these structures required organization, planning, coordination on a scale never before attempted. The royal funerary works became the center of vast logistical networks. Entire villages specialized in the production of tools, ropes, ceramics, food, and clothing just to sustain the workers and priests of these constructions. Quarries were opened in the south, and specialized barges transported blocks for hundreds of kilometers. Egypt, by building for its dead, was also transforming the life of the living. New routes emerged, new techniques were perfected, knowledge accumulated. The state grew, and with it, the notion that Egypt was different from all other peoples because it was the only one that knew how to converse with time. And so, as the sun continued to rise in the east and die in the west, as the green fields swayed in the wind and the workshops resonated with the sound of hammer on copper, the pyramids ceased to be an exception. They became an ideal, a promise, a sacred language. Stone had defeated mud. The staircase had defeated the flat plain. Immortality, once whispered in the temples, now rose on the horizon, visible to all, even from a distance, even centuries later. And Egypt, for the first time, fully understood what it meant to build forever. When silence sealed the pyramid of Djoser, it sealed not just the tomb of a king. It sealed a new way of thinking about time, space, and human destiny itself. There, at Saqqara, rested not just a body, but a landmark. From that moment on, no ruler could simply die. No king could rest anonymously under the mud again. Egypt had discovered how to make visible that which was invisible: eternity. But this discovery did not generate satisfaction. It generated ambition. Djoser's successors, observing the artificial mountain that dominated the plain, understood that power, if it could be engraved in stone, needed to grow. Each king desired to leave his mark. Each reign, now, needed a work that surpassed the previous one. And more than that, it needed to reflect perfection. Because if the pyramid was the mirror of the cosmos, then it could no longer be just a symbolic staircase. It needed to be an absolute form, a pure geometry pointing to the sky, not by steps, but by uninterrupted lines. And so was born the impulse that would guide the next kings, the smooth-sided pyramid. This new form did not arise from nothing. It was a slow transition, made of trial and error. The architects, inspired by Djoser's step pyramid, began to soften its angles, to fill its steps, to experiment with new alignments. At Meidum, south of Saqqara, a pyramid was begun that intended to be smooth from the start. A bold project, which would partially collapse either during its construction or shortly after. Its inner layers revealed miscalculations, but also a vision, the desire to achieve the final form, the perfect pyramid. Soon after, at Dashur, another attempt would be made. The king, now known as Snefru, sought to achieve the impossible. Not just one, but two pyramids in his reign. The first, the one today called the Bent Pyramid, was born as pure ambition. Its base was wide, and the initial angles were acute, too steep, too inclined. During construction, cracks and subsidence forced the engineers to alter the project. The incline was softened, resulting in a unique form. A pyramid that rises with impetus and then gently curves towards the sky. A visible imperfection, but one that revealed the builder's learning. Snefru did not give up. Still at Dashur, he ordered a new pyramid to be erected. This time, with all calculations redone, all errors avoided. Every block adjusted with precision. The result was an unprecedented work. The Red Pyramid, so called because of the coloration of its outer blocks, was the first complete, smooth-sided pyramid in history. Immense, solid, with clean lines, internal corridors aligned with the stars. and a simple but effective burial chamber. With it, Snefru not only secured his eternal rest, he established the new standard of the eternal. But while his tombs grew in size, the pharaonic ideology grew in depth. The king was no longer just an intermediary between men and the gods. He was a god himself. During life, he reigned as the son of Ra, the sun. After death, he united with him, crossing the sky in a luminous boat. This divine elevation was not merely symbolic. It was written in stone, engraved in the royal titles, recited in hymns, enacted in coronation rituals and sacred jubilees. The Egyptian state, centered on the figure of the pharaoh, became even more robust. The funerary works, especially the pyramids, began to require a national infrastructure. They were no longer local projects. They were enterprises of continental scale, quarries in the south, workshops in the delta, ports on the Nile, warehouses, planned villages, roads opened to transport blocks weighing several tons. The logistics were precise. The workers lived in temporary cities near the construction sites. They worked in rotating shifts with breaks for rituals, festivities, and rest. They received fresh bread, dried fish, fermented beer, vegetables, and even medical care. The names of some of these teams have been preserved. The drunkards of the North Wind, the friends of Snefru, the strong ones of Ra. They were groups organized not just as workers, but as spiritual communities whose labor was an act of devotion. Technology also advanced. Copper tools were improved. Levers, simple pulleys, ramps of sand and clay. Collective intelligence refined the use of materials. The blocks were extracted, polished, aligned with millimeter precision. The internal tunnels calculated based on the cardinal points. And all of this without haste, without improvisation, with infinite patience. Because in Egypt, what was made in haste died young. And nothing, absolutely nothing, made for the king could die. The cult of the dead kings also gained new scale. Around the pyramids, complex funerary temples were erected. There, priests kept the flame of the royal name alive. There, daily offerings were made. Bread, water, incense, cattle meat, beer. It was an endless cycle. The dead king fed the gods, and the gods, in return, guaranteed the fertility of the land. Egypt prospered as long as its memory was preserved. Ma'at, the cosmic order, was guaranteed not only by good harvests or internal peace. It was sustained by the remembrance and continuous worship of the kings. At dusk, the pyramids cast their shadows over the desert. The stones glowed slowly under the sun. At the top of the temples, the priests lit lamps. Sacred chants echoed among the columns, while the people, in distant villages, knew that the king was there, even dead, still present, guiding the waters, protecting the skies, steadying the world. And so, with each new king, the impulse was renewed. Snefru's pyramid was just the beginning of an era in which faith, stone, and administration would unite to raise what no people had ever dared to conceive. A civilization dedicated not to the ephemeral, but to the immutable. Egypt had discovered that eternity could be designed. Now, it began to sculpt it with perfection. With the death of Snefru, Egypt did not lose just a king. It lost an architect of eternity. In his life, he had taught that death could be molded, measured, calculated. His red pyramid, resting serenely on the plain of Dashur, remained as a testament to a new era. the era of sacred geometry. But what came after was not hesitation. It was continuity. His successor, a young man named Khufu, son of Snefru, inherited not only the throne, he inherited the vision, and with it, an impulse older than any dynasty, the desire to build not for personal glory, but for permanence. He looked not only to his father, he looked to the sky, and desired that his pyramid not only touch the firmament, but imitate it. It was then that the eyes of Egypt turned to the west bank of the Nile, where the gentle hills of Giza rose firmly on the horizon. There, where the sun set over the desert and the winds blew in silence, Khufu chose to erect his name. The construction began without announcement. There were no celebrations, only silence, calculations, measurements. Engineers and priests gathered to observe the stars. They aligned the four corners with the cardinal points, not by chance, but by spiritual necessity. A poorly oriented pyramid was like a poorly pronounced prayer. It did not reach its destination. And when the project was defined, the work began, not with shouts, but with rhythms, hammers striking, stones being cut, sand ramps being smoothed. The construction site became a city. Workers lived in simple houses, organized into teams, supervised by scribes. They received daily rations of bread, fish, vegetables, and beer. There, no one was a slave. They were free men, proud to serve the pharaoh, aware that they were shaping something greater than life itself. Each block of stone was extracted with care, came from distant quarries, transported by barges on the Nile, dragged by sled over moistened sand, raised with ramps that grew along with the pyramid itself. There were more than 2 million blocks, each weighing tons, placed with such precision that, even centuries later, the blade of a knife would not pass between them. The work was monumental, but there was something beyond technique. There was silence. There was reverence. Each stone laid was a gesture of faith. Each ramp shaped a staircase to the heavens. The architects did not see their work only with human eyes. They traced it with maps of the firmament. The pyramid was not just a form. It was a fallen star, a living mountain. Inside the pyramid, narrow passages advance towards the heart of the structure. Inner chambers, hidden, silent, protected by immense slabs. None of them were built by chance. There was the vertical axis of the pharaoh, pointing to the circumpolar stars, those that never set. It was there that his soul should go, to join the lights that never die. Around the pyramid, more structures were erected. A funerary temple, a valley temple, on the banks of the Nile, a ceremonial road connecting the two. Solar boats buried in the deep pits so that the king could sail the skies just as he sailed the waters. Chapels, stelae, houses for the priests. The pyramid was the heart of an entire world, a microcosm of stone, a mirror of the universe. And when, after years of work, the work was completed, Egypt contemplated the impossible. There stood the impossible. There, on the sands of Giza, rose a perfect form, smooth, symmetrical, colossal. 4 faces that met at an invisible apex, pointing to the sky. An unimaginable weight, sustained not by tricks, but by wisdom. A mountain built by will. A motionless prayer. Khufu's tomb bore no inscriptions, no text, no image. It was pure silence, as if the king, in his wisdom, understood that the true name need not be written when it is engraved in the firmament. Future generations would look upon that monument and not understand how it was made. But those who lived there knew. The pyramid was less a physical feat and more a spiritual one. It was the result of the alliance between man, the cosmos, and order, and that alliance did not end with Khufu. His son, Jedefre, and then his grandson, Khafre, would follow in his footsteps. New pyramids would arise, and on the same Giza plateau, another wonder would take shape. A lion's body with a human face carved from living stone. What would later be called the Sphinx was born not as a symbol of mystery, but of vigilance. It guarded the royal tombs, facing east, waiting for the rebirth of the sun. It was the guardian of silence, the stone face of time itself. And so, Giza became the visible altar of Egypt, a place where the past remained alive, where the names of the kings were not just remembered, they were seen, felt, measured by the shadow of midday. At dusk, the sky over the pyramids turned golden. The winds carried the scent of warm stone. The priests lit their lamps, and the peasants in the distance knew that the king still reigned. Not on the wooden throne of the palace hall, but on the stone throne that defied death. And in the heart of the Egyptian people, a truth grew, slow and steady as the pyramid, that nothing dies while it is remembered, and that everything raised in harmony with the sky, even if made by human hands, can last as long as the stars. The pyramids rose on the horizon like perfect mountains, motionless and serene, cutting against the sky of an Egypt that, little by little, learned to live around them. They were not just kings' tombs. They were presences that shaped the rhythm of time, the faith of the people, the very space in which life happened. Beneath their shadows, another Egypt grew, an Egypt made not of kings, but of anonymous men and women, artisans, farmers, priests, workers, mothers, children, common people whose hands molded bricks, harvested barley, wrote names, fished for tilapia, lit lamps. While the kings raised their eternity in stone, these people sustained the continuity of life with small, repeated gestures. Near the great constructions, entire villages flourished. They were not makeshift camps. They were organized communities, carefully planned. Narrow streets, mud brick houses, workshops, bakeries, wells, granaries. There lived the pyramid workers, trained men, many specialized, proud of their functions. They were divided into teams with their own names, as if they were spiritual armies. Some carved their nicknames into the stones they laid, the friends of Khufu, the drunkards of the West, silent signatures on the body of eternity. These workers did not live in misery. They received daily rations, coarse bread, strong beer, salted fish, cooked vegetables. Some had access to meat, dates, onions. They had doctors, masseurs, cooks. Some documents found centuries later record sick leave for fever, ankle injuries, or family mourning. They were hard lives, yes, but protected by a system that saw work as devotion, not punishment. In the workshops, the sound of chisels on stone was constant. Sculptors shaped limestone statues. Metalworkers crafted copper tools. Potters fired jars with the care of those preparing offerings. Carpenters carved beds, thrones, boxes, miniature boats. Each object had a specific destiny. Nothing was trivial. Even the simplest vessel could serve as a container for sacred perfume. The scribes were a caste apart. They were the eyes and ears of the state. They sat on mats with wooden pallets propped on their legs, brushes made of reeds, red and black ink. and papyrus sheets rolled with delicacy. They recorded everything: tributes, grain measures, offering inventories, royal orders, hymns, funerary formulas. A good scribe not only knew how to write, he knew how to organize the world. Because for Egypt, what was not written did not exist. And in the temples, always facing east, the priests maintained the delicate balance between the visible and the invisible. They bathed the divine statues in silence, adorned them with jewelry, offered symbolic meals, bread, fruit, wine, incense. Each ritual was a repetition of the divine acts at the dawn of creation. For the sun to rise, it was necessary to open the eyes of the statue. For the Nile to flow, it was necessary to chant the right hymns. The gods needed to be kept awake, fed, venerated, not out of vanity, but so that the world would not fall asleep. Around the temples also lived astronomers, healers, musicians, sacred dancers. Everything was part of the same body. Everything had a function. There was no idleness. There was rhythm. In the more distant villages, along the banks of the Nile, life was simpler, but no less sacred. The farmer plowed the land with thin-horned oxen. The woman, in a linen skirt and barefoot, ground grain on flat stones. Children ran among the palm trees, hunting locusts, learning the names of the fish. At sunset, everyone stopped. It was time for rest and prayer. The sky blushed in golden tones, and the lamps were lit, one by one, like earthly stars. Amidst this daily life, the dead were never absent. In the homes, stelae with the names of deceased relatives guarded discreet corners. The dead were remembered, symbolically fed, called by name. Forgetting was the second death. The tomb, however simple, was carefully painted, and on the walls, scenes of the agricultural paradise were depicted. Endless fields, abundant harvests, lakes with lotus flowers, solar boats crossing blue skies. This paradise was not a distant invention. It was an extension of what was already known. Because for the Egyptian, the afterlife was Egypt, but without pain, without hunger, without death. And so, every gesture in life was a preparation. Every song, a prayer. Every meal, an offering in miniature. Religion was not a separate sphere. It was the soil from which life sprouted. Religious festivals filled the calendar. On fixed dates, sacred boats went out in procession through the canals. Crowds followed the images of the gods, dancing, singing, drinking beer. At night, torches lit the courtyards, and the stories of the myths were enacted by priests and actors. The creation of the world, the death and resurrection of Osiris, the journey of Ra through the underworld, everything was relived. And the people, watching, did not just learn. They participated. It was a living, pulsating Egypt. And amidst all of this, the pyramids remained, distant but visible, solid but silent. They did not impose themselves, they observed. They were part of the world like the Nile, like the sun, like the palm tree, or the eagle. Children grew up in their shadow. The elderly died looking at them. Caravans guided themselves by their silhouettes. Priests prayed facing their faces. And so, slowly, a truth solidified in the heart of the people, that living in a shadow of eternity was, in some way, touching the eternal every day. There was a sound in ancient Egypt that never ceased. It was not the cry of the waterfowl, nor the rustle of palms in the wind, nor the crackle of clay in the kilns. It was the constant sound of work. Hammer against stone, pestle against grain, brush on papyrus, chant over silence. A rhythmic sound, ordered almost ritualistic. Because in Egypt, work was not separable from the sacred. It was a prolonged prayer, made with hands. In the shadow of the pyramids, crafts flourished, like parallel temples. There were the sculptors, who knew the faces of the gods better than the people themselves. They worked in the sun or by lamplight, carving blocks of limestone and granite with simple tools, but attentive eyes. The eyes that sculpted the statues did not seek to imitate, they sought to reveal. A good sculptor did not create the divine, he liberated it from the stone. In the jewelry workshops, the goldsmiths heated gold in clay bowls, shaping rings, necklaces, pendants, small amulets with eyes of Horus, scarabs, lotuses, jackals. Each piece had a magical function. It was not ornamentation, it was protection. A blue faience necklace could ward off illness. A gold bracelet with turquoise could ensure a good crossing in the afterlife. The carpenters worked imported woods, cedar from Lebanon, ebony from Nubia, transforming them into beds with carved feet, chests, funerary boxes, ceremonial oars, masts, litters. The sacred boats, carried in processions, passed through their hands. In them, images were not transported. The sacred itself was transported. And among all these crafts, there were always the scribes. With their ink palettes, wooden boards, and tired eyes, they recorded life like those who seal time. They were everywhere, in the ports, on the farms, in the temples, in the courts, in the warehouses, in the royal chambers. They cataloged order, and where there was order, there was ma'at. Nothing was random. Egypt was a land of rhythms. The Nile floods marked the seasons. Akhet, the inundation, when the fields were submerged and agricultural work ceased. It was time to repair houses, make offerings, sculpt. Then came Pere, the season of emergence. The moist soil flourished and planting began. Finally, Shemu, the time of harvest. And then everything began again. The cycles of the sky were reflected in the cycles of the earth, and the cycles of the earth were reflected in those of men. In the homes, the day began early. The peasants left with baskets and hoes, guiding oxen and donkeys along beaten paths. The women lit the fire, baked flatbreads, cooked lentils, cut onions. Children played with clay dolls, wooden bows, little figures with strings. Some learned to chant hymns. Others imitated the gestures of adults, already preparing to repeat the order of the world. The interior of the houses was simple. Hard-packed dirt floor, mats, clay pots, water jars, woven baskets. But even there, far from the palaces and temples, there was space for the sacred. Small niches with images of protective gods, dried papyrus flowers, eyes of Horus painted on the walls. The home was an extension of the temple. The kitchen, an extension of the offering. Life, a continuous ritual. At the end of the day, the sun plunged into the west, and with it, the god Ra, in his boat, sailed into the underworld. The sky darkened slowly. The sounds diminished. The winds grew colder. The gods of the night awoke. It was time to light the lamps, tell stories, recite the names of ancestors, and seal the home with silence and the smoke of incense. And even when the body slept, the soul dreamed of the afterlife, an afterlife made of fields identical to those on earth, but perfect, without hunger, without pain, without injustice. There, the well-prepared dead could fish, harvest, sing, live in peace. But to reach there, more than rituals were needed. One needed to have lived with righteousness. The soul would be judged, the heart would be weighed. And if it was lighter than the feather of truth, the crossing would be complete. Therefore, Egyptian ethics were clear, though silent. Do not lie, do not steal, do not kill, do not cheat, do not desecrate the dead, do not break oaths. It was less a code and more a habit, because everything in Egypt depended on balance, and to unbalance was to put the world at risk. The temples, in fact, were not places of collective worship, as would be known centuries later. They were the heart of the world, maintained by priests and initiates. There, in increasingly hidden precincts, the gods lived. Their statues were bathed, fed, perfumed, not out of caprice, but because their well-being guaranteed the well-being of the cosmos. Every dawn, every flood, every birth, every harvest was the fruit of this invisible harmony. During the great festivals, such as the Opet in Thebes, or the Festival of the Beauty of Hathor in Dendera, the people approached the sacred. The images of the gods were taken out of the temples, carried in procession by water or through the streets. Songs, dances, laughter, food. For a brief moment, the people touched the mystery, and the mystery smiled back. And all of this happened under the constant gaze of the pyramids. They remained motionless, but never absent. They were landmarks in the landscape and in the mind. They were ports of the soul. When someone died, it was said that they departed to the west, not as an escape, but as a return. The tombs, even humble ones, imitated those of the nobles, because everyone desired the same: to be remembered, to keep the name alive, to be received in the world beyond like one returning home. Life in ancient Egypt was not perfect. There were illnesses, there was pain, there were losses, but there was also consolation, because everything had meaning. And where there is meaning, there is peace. The people of the Nile did not only build pyramids, they built a civilization where daily life was crossed by invisible light, where every gesture, however simple, was part of something immense, where dying was not an end, but a transition, where living was preparing, not for oblivion, but for permanence. And so, between the noise of the workshops and the chant of the temples, between the harvests and the funerals, between the birth of children and the remembrance of the dead, Egypt followed its course, steady, slow, sacred, like the Nile, like time, like eternity. Before the stone, before the papyrus, even before the Nile ran between its banks, there was silence, a profound silence, without sound, without form, without light. Thus said the Egyptian myths about the beginning of everything. In the beginning, there was the watery chaos, Nun, a boundless ocean, motionless, untouched. And it was from this abyss that slowly emerged a primitive mound, the Benben, the first gesture of form in the midst of absence. There, on the mound, the first god awoke. In some traditions, he was Atum, the all-in-one, who generated himself. In others, he was Ptah, who created the world with the Word, or Ra, who emerged with the sun on the border between being and non-being. The name varied, but the gesture was the same. The world began with the awakening of consciousness, with the birth of order from chaos. Egypt did not believe in a single god, but neither did it see the gods as separate and rival entities. They were manifestations of the same principle, life that orders itself. Each god was a face of this process, a role in the theater of the cosmos. The sun, water, love, death, rebirth, silence. Everything had form, name, and will. And everything was connected to everything. Thus were born the great cosmogonies. In Heliopolis, the world began with Atum, who generated Shu, the air, and Tefnut, moisture. These, in turn, gave rise to Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. Their children were Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, the eternal protagonists of the world's drama: death, mourning, conflict, restoration. In Memphis, it was said that Ptah created everything with the heart and the tongue, thought and word. In Hermopolis, the world came from 8 primordial deities, 4 pairs, males with frog heads, females with serpent heads, who embodied the primordial forces of darkness, water, infinity, and invisibility. These versions did not compete. There was no heresy. Egypt understood that the divine is plural, and that truth does not contradict itself. It complements itself. Therefore, a god could have 1,000 forms, 1,000 names, 1,000 myths. A god could have 1,000 forms, 1,000 names, 1,000 myths. The same animal could represent different powers. The cow was Hathor, but also Mehet-Weret. The falcon was Horus, but also Ra. The jackal was Anubis, but also Duamutef. The mystery was not exhausted. It expanded. But among all these gods, Egypt knew that there was something more essential than any divine form. There was Ma'at. Ma'at was not a goddess in the traditional sense. It was a principle, a presence, an absolute truth. It was order, the way the world should be, the harmony between heaven and earth, the regular cycle of the seasons, justice, truth, the balance between word and gesture, between death and rebirth. And maintaining Ma'at was the supreme duty, not only of the gods, but of men. And among men, there was one who carried this responsibility above all others: the pharaoh. The king was not just a ruler. He was the son of Ra, born of the sky and sent to earth. His birth was sacred. His coronation, a rite of cosmic restoration. When he ascended the throne, the world was renewed. By wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the king not only unified the lands, he unified the visible and the invisible. He was the guardian of Ma'at. And his function was not only political, it was metaphysical. His role was to maintain order against the advance of chaos. His justice was more than administration. It was operative magic. A royal decree could restore the balance of a village, a province, a field. When he won a war, it was not just a military triumph. It was a reaffirmation of universal order over the forces of disorder. In the palace, advisors knelt before him, not as subjects of flesh, but as servants of a divine entity. Royal audiences were ceremonies. The thrones, carved with sacred symbols, the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt, together on the sovereign's brow, were more than ornaments. They were the visible form of cosmic union. And in everything he did, the king was accompanied by priests and scribes. Every gesture was noted, every word measured. Nothing was trivial. A simple gesture of offering at the festivals of Ma'at could be the link that sustained the rotation of the sky. In the temples, the king's name was recited alongside those of the gods. On every obelisk, it was engraved within cartouches, circles that represented eternity. Even after his death, the king continued to reign as a star, as a spirit, as a presence in rituals. His name was not erased. It was repeated, sung, worshipped. And so the temples grew. They grew as palaces of the invisible, with courtyards, colonnades, halls, and pylons, dark sanctuaries. One entered through the light and advanced towards the shadow. From the outer world to the inner world. From the crowd to silence. Every wall was a book of stone. Every relief a frozen prayer. The gods were depicted in scenes of offering, creation, judgment. The pharaoh always appeared strong, young, unchanging, even if he were already dead. The temples were more than buildings. They were living organisms. Each day, rituals renewed their soul. The priests woke early, fasted, bathed, dressed in white. They entered the sanctuaries with chants. They washed the divine statue with water from the 4 directions. They perfumed it with myrrh. They dressed it in linen. They offered bread, beer, meat, incense. Then they sealed the doors, like one closing the eyes of a dreaming god. None of this was superstition. It was maintenance of the world. Because in Egypt, the cosmos was not static. It was fragile, and it needed to be sustained every day, from the highest palace to the smallest field, from the king's burial chamber to a peasant's domestic altar. Ma'at was the axis of everything. And the pharaoh, in life and after death, was the invisible mast that kept the sky suspended over the earth. In the heart of Egypt, the gods did not live only in temples. They lived in stories. And among all the stories, there was one that was told in silence, murmured in dark corners, carved on tomb walls, repeated like a secret that needed to be remembered so that the world would not forget itself. It was the drama of Osiris. It was said that Osiris had been the first king, a god who taught men to plant, to judge, to govern with justice. But his brother Seth, the god of the desert, of chaos, of violence, envied his throne. He tricked him, killed him, dismembered his body, and scattered its parts across the land. It was then that Isis, wife and sister of Osiris, began the search. She traveled through Egypt with patience and power, gathering each piece of the dead god. With the help of Nephthys and Anubis, she restored his body. And with a divine breath, she became pregnant by him. From this was born Horus, the heir. While Osiris descended to the underworld to reign as judge, Horus grew. And when he reached strength, he faced Seth in combat. They fought for days and nights, on land and in the waters. Finally, Horus won. But he did not kill his uncle. He ascended the throne as king of the living, while Osiris reigned over the dead. The world was restored. This myth was more than allegory. It was foundation. Every king was Horus. Every death was Osiris. Every burial, a repetition of the cosmic drama. Mourning, justice, restoration. Everything was contained in this cycle. Therefore, the tombs were prepared with such care, not to imprison the body, but to liberate the soul, not to isolate the dead, but to return them to the greater order. And at the center of this order, there was a sacred moment, the judgment of the soul. When someone died, their ba, the part of the soul that could move, dream, remember, left the body. It was led by Anubis to the Hall of Truth. There, before Osiris, the dead were judged. Their heart was placed on a scale, weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was lighter, they passed. If it was heavy with guilt, it was devoured by Amit, the devourer, part lioness, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. There was no eternal hell. There was only oblivion, the worst possible fate, to cease to exist. But to reach the judgment, the dead needed help. They needed names, formulas, protection. Therefore, the tombs of the Egyptians were not just storage rooms. They were maps of the afterlife. On the walls, the funerary texts, later known as the pyramid texts, described the paths, the dangers, the names of the guardians, the spells to cross lakes of fire, serpents, doors that only opened with the exact words. Each prayer was a key, each image a bridge, and therefore knowledge was sacred. Knowing the names of the gods, knowing the stories, knowing the hymns was guaranteeing passage. The dead person needed to know who he was, who the gods were, what his place was in the order of things. Identity was the passport to eternity, and the name, its pillar. For this reason, erasing a name was the most serious crime. It was to kill the soul forever. Alongside this subterranean path, another journey took place. Every day, visible in the sky, the solar voyage of Ra. During the day, Ra crossed the sky in his solar bark. He illuminated the earth, warmed the fields, established Ma'at. But at dusk, he plunged into the west and began a second, more dangerous journey through the Duat, the underworld. There, he faced serpents of chaos, like Apophis, who tried to swallow his light. He passed through 12 portals, through flaming lakes, through corridors where only memory could guide. He was escorted by gods, guardians, and even by the souls of the righteous. At midnight, Ra met Osiris, and from the encounter between the sun and death, the dawn was born. The cycle was renewed. This myth was not just belief. It was cosmic repetition. The Egyptian people saw, every day, proof that light could overcome darkness. And when they buried their dead, they made them like Ra, armed, prepared, guided, with amulets, with hymns, with golden eyes upon the chest, with scarabs over the heart. On the walls of the tombs, the deceased was depicted plowing celestial fields, fishing in luminous canals, meeting their loved ones, sailing in the boats of the sky. It was a paradise, but not a distant paradise. It was a continuity, because Egypt did not believe in a separation between this world and the other. Life and death were banks of the same river, and that was why everything needed to be in balance. The temple needed to function. The pharaoh needed to make offerings. The people needed to respect the rituals, because every time something broke, an unrepaired injustice, a forgotten name, an unburied body, Ma'at faltered. And if it fell, the world would fall with it. Therefore, all of Egypt was a spiritual construction. The laws, the taxes, the ceremonies, the dances, the inscriptions, the cities, the obelisks, the calendars, the tales, the thrones, the tombs, the pyramids. Everything was an expression of a single task to keep the world standing. And this task was not only for the gods or the king, it was for everyone, each with their part. The scribe with his words, the peasant with his harvest, the mason with his plumb line, the priest with his offering, the dead with their memory, the living with their conduct. Thus lived Egypt under the eyes of the gods, with the weight of Ma'at on their shoulders and the hope of eternity in their hearts. For centuries, the pyramids stood solemnly on the Egyptian horizon, like beacons of eternity. Each one, more than a tomb, was an affirmation. The king lives, the world is in order, Ma'at remains firm. But time, even in that world that intended to dominate it, could not be suspended. And slowly, like the wind that wears away stone without haste, the splendor of the pyramids began to yield. It was not a collapse. There was no exact moment. It was not like a flame that goes out, but like a lamp that dims in silence, The decline of the pyramids began like everything in Egypt, with slowness and reverence. The pyramids of the 4th dynasty, those erected by Khufu, Khafre, and Menkore, marked the apex of an ideal. Colossal monuments with smooth faces, precise engineering, aligned with the sky, with vast funerary temples, ceremonial causeways, and entire communities dedicated to their maintenance. But after this peak, something changed. The kings of the 5th dynasty still erected pyramids, but smaller, more modest. At Abu Sir, between Saqqara and Giza, the tombs of Userkaf, Sahure, Neferirkare, and Nusere arose. They were still pyramids, but without the solidity of Khufu's times. The blocks were smaller, often supported by fillings of rubble and mortar. The stone had lost its voice. Resources were less abundant, the rains shorter, the priorities different, and yet the material decay was accompanied by a symbolic ascent. It was at this time that the pyramid texts appeared for the first time, funerary inscriptions carved on the inner walls of the royal chambers. It was as if, faced with the fragility of stone, the Egyptians sought another form of eternity, the Word. These texts were not just instructions. They were incantations, formulas, sacred maps. They described the soul's ascent, the words to be spoken before the guardians, the names of the gods that would open the doors of heaven. They transformed the tomb into a book of stone. And in that book, the king was the protagonist of his own divinization. The change was clear. Less focus on the mass of the pyramid, more focus on the spiritual complexity of the afterlife. The funerary temples, in turn, became more elaborate. Courtyards, colonnades, altars, relics. While the pyramid shrank, the temple grew. Because now, more than ever, the post-mortem cult became essential. Keeping the king's name alive was keeping his presence active in the world. And that presence was sustained not by the height of the pyramid, but by the continuity of offerings, prayers, and sacred readings. This transformation was not merely theological, it was political. During the 4th dynasty, the king was absolute. His projects moved the country. Resources flowed with obedience. But over time, royal power began to fragment. The nomarchs, regional governors, became more autonomous. Some local families accumulated wealth, influence, militias. The king's orders took longer to be obeyed. The state machinery still functioned, but it creaked. And with this decentralization came also the multiplication of the sacred. The tombs of high officials began to spread, to grow, to imitate royal models. At Saqqara, at Abu Sir, at Maydum, mastabas appeared decorated with scenes of daily life, offerings, lists of goods. The lords of the administration began to see themselves as co-participants in the sacred not merely servants of the pharaoh, but partners in the maintenance of Ma'at. Eternity, once reserved for the king, became a collective dream. And to sustain it, rituals multiplied. Bureaucracy grew. The priests gained more power. The temple was no longer just an appendage of the pyramid. It was a vital center. There were scribes dedicated to counting offerings, warehouse supervisors, guardians of papyri, caretakers of images. A whole new administrative elite flourished under the mantle of the gods. The gods, in turn, drew closer to the people. Until then, religion was essentially royal. The king spoke with Ra, with Horus, with Ptah, and through him, order was maintained. But now, the gods took on their own face. They began to be worshipped with greater proximity. Osiris, above all, grew, god of death, of resurrection, of judgment. His myth, ancient, now became central. The people no longer looked only to Ra, the solar god who was born and died every day, but to Osiris, the god who died once and rose forever. And where the cult of Osiris flourished, the king ceased to be the only bridge to the afterlife. Now, every Egyptian could dream of immortality, as long as they lived with justice, with truth, with a light heart. The tombs of the rich became more elaborate, those of the poor more symbolic. But in all of them, there was a new longing to be remembered. The name, the face, the occupation, the prayer, everything needed to be preserved. Eternity was being democratized, and in this world that still seemed ordered, but where the stones no longer echoed as before, a new phase was taking shape. The pyramids of the 6th dynasty, like those of Teti, Pepi I, and Pepi II, were small. They repeated the form, but not the force. Some were already deteriorating from their construction. And in the villages, in the distant lands, murmurs grew. The king was still divine. The gods still listened. Order still held. For now, the hymns continued. The rituals were performed. The Nile still rose. But on the horizon, like a tenuous cloud over the desert, Egypt began to sense something unthinkable, that even eternity needed to change. In the ancient times of Egypt, the world seemed eternal. The Nile flowed. The floods came. The gods listened. The kings reigned. Everything had its place. But eternity, which Egypt so sought to build in stone, began to crumble, not under the weight of war, but under the burden of time. What was firm became fragile. What was absolute began to be negotiated. And what was a unified voice began to fracture into distinct murmurs. The 5th dynasty was a long echo of what had once been vigor. The kings still built pyramids, but now with smaller blocks, on more fragile foundations, in quieter deserts. The pyramid of Pepi II, the last great king of the Old Kingdom, was perhaps the clearest symbol of this change. Small, hidden among others, its stones already cracked under the weight of neglect. It was said that Pepi II had reigned for more than 90 years, a time too long even for a king, and long enough for the structures around him to slowly unravel. During his early years, Egypt still functioned. The temples held. The sacred texts were still copied with precision. The temples held. The sacred texts were still copied with precision. But as the decades passed, something wore away. Not in the monuments, but in the invisible bonds that maintained order. The nomarchs, governors of the Egyptian regions, became increasingly powerful. Their tombs became larger. Their genealogies longer. Their names more firmly carved in the rock. In Thebes, in Aswan, in Abydos, noble families began to act with their own authority. Orders from the palace took time to arrive. In some cases, they simply never arrived. The cult of the pharaoh, he who was Maat in human form, became more and more a formality. The offerings to the dead kings, once sustained by great estates and dedicated priests, grew scarce. Royal tombs were looted, statues toppled, and even in the temples, there were records of delivery delays, cuts and tributes, administrative silences, and the people felt it. The peasants, always attentive to the seasons, noticed the failures in the harvests. Some years, the Nile did not rise as before. The land did not darken. The barley withered. The water became mud. Bread became scarcer. And when the belly is empty, faith begins to tremble. In the villages, rumors grew. They said the gods were angry, that Ma'at was broken, that the king had aged too much, and with him, time itself had grown tired. They were not blasphemies, they were fears. A new feeling haunted the villages, abandonment. In the tombs of some high officials from that time, the texts already revealed a change. Instead of exalting the king, many speak of themselves, of their works, of how they built their mastabas, their canals, their chapels. They became protagonists of their own eternity. Central authority was no longer enough. It was necessary to secure one's own name. The clearest symbol of this was the increasing use of the coffin texts. Unlike the ancient pyramid texts, which were a royal privilege, these new spells began to be inscribed inside the coffins of nobles and officials. The same spells, the same names of gods, the same magical doors, now accessible to those who could pay. Eternity was no longer a monopoly. It was a commodity. Religiosity became more intimate. The great solar god, Ra, began to lose ground to figures closer, more human. Osiris, the dead god who knew pain, grew as a symbol of hope. His cult expanded throughout the country, especially in Abydos, where multitudes pilgrimaged. There, the myth was enacted. Death, mourning, search, resurrection. It was as if the people said to the gods, "We also die. Hear us too." The change was as spiritual as it was political. Stones lost their centrality. Royal names vanished from records. Egypt fractured, not in open war, but in internal fragmentation. In a land where everything always moved with ritual slowness, ruin did not come as a break. It came as silence. After the death of Pepi II, darkness fell upon the records. Later chroniclers called this period the First Intermediate Period. But for those who lived there was no name. There was only the void. Cities that once prospered became isolated. Canals clogged, warehouses emptied, families migrated, seeking water, seeking bread, seeking meaning. Some texts survive, fragments of lamentation. One of them, known today as the Lamentations of Ippur, describes an unrecognizable Egypt. The poor have become rich. The rich beg. The temples are burned. Laws no longer exist. The earth spins like a potter's wheel. And even in this chaos, something persisted. The funerary formulas, now spread across all classes. The small tombs, still adorned with eyes of Horus. The figurines of funerary workers. The scarabs, the amulets. Egypt did not disappear. It only withdrew. The great pyramids were no longer built, but their shadows remained present, even abandoned, even looted, even cracked. They remained. Silent witnesses of an ideal that time did not kill, only transformed. And so, at the end of the Old Kingdom, Egypt learned something new. That eternity is not made only of stone, but also of word, of memory, of resilience, and that even silence can be a temple. The Nile still flowed. The palm trees still bent before the wind. The gods were still invoked. But something had broken. Not with a crash, but with absence. With the end of the 6th dynasty and the death of Pepi II, Egypt entered a period that future scribes would describe with caution, and poets with lament. It was as if, at the end of such a long reign, time itself had forgotten to move on, and eternity, which was once certain, became doubtful. What followed was not an invasion, nor a plague, nor a single disaster. It was something more subtle, the slow disintegration of the country's invisible seams. The king, once the axis of the cosmos, now was just a name among many, The palace no longer sent orders to the provinces. The warehouses no longer distributed grain. The temples, without sustenance, fell silent. Offerings dwindled. Priests improvised. Egypt broke into pieces. Each region, each nome, began to govern itself as it could. The nomarchs, local governors, became kings in miniature. In Thebes, in Heracleopolis, in Asyut, local chiefs erected modest palaces, founded lineages, wrote their own hymns. The country, once a single body, now trembled in fragments. An arm that did not recognize the leg, an eye that no longer met the mouth. And even so, the people lived. In the villages, routines did not stop. Wheat was sown. Papyrus was harvested. Children ran on the muddy banks. Clay was molded into pots. Offerings were made with what was available. Bread was scarcer. Beer was thinner. Eyes were more watchful. But life continued. Because in Egypt, even when the top crumbles, the roots know where they are. Insecurity, however, left its marks. Some tombs were looted not by distant thieves, but by familiar hands. Neighbors, perhaps. Hunger makes even the most intimate strangers. And for many, the afterlife seemed more distant than ever. Scribes wrote with smaller letters. Papyri were reused. Temples were closed or transformed into storage. And yet, in the midst of this slowly crumbling world, something surprising sprouted. Creation. With weakened centralization, regional voices gained space. In Thebes, a new artistic style flourished. Paintings, more human, more dynamic. The faces gained expression. The scenes of daily life became protagonists. Harvests, dances, boats, games. The sacred was no longer distant. It was in the fisherman's hands, in the cook's pot, in the potter's gesture. The divine, now, lived in the details. The funerary texts also changed. The coffin texts multiplied. Different versions appeared, new combinations, personalized formulas. Each dead person was a world. Each tomb, a small, closed universe. The desire for permanence, which once rose in stone, was now engraved in wood, in ink, in word, and on the walls of the tombs of the new lords. Something new was seen. Self-portraits of fragility. I built this tomb with my own resources, some said. No man helped me. Others added, I placed Ma'at in the place of injustice, as if trying to convince the gods that even without a king, there was still order, there was still meaning. In Heracleopolis, a new lineage of kings emerged, less majestic, more administrative. Their names would not echo like those of Djoser or Khufu, but their decrees show effort to rebuild canals, pacify roots, restore temples. It was a government of patches. They tried to keep standing a house whose columns were already trembling. Further south, in Thebes, another lineage grew, still small, still obscure, but with time, with patience, with faith. They called themselves the restorers of order. They did not march with swords, but with ideals. They did not proclaim conquest, but continuity. The south looked to the north, not with fury, but with longing. And it was this longing for the past that prepared the future. At the center of this dark age, there is a text, a small mirror of the spirit of that time. Called by moderns, the dispute between a man and his Ba. It portrays a man tired of life, talking with his soul. He says the world is full of evil, that death seems a relief. But his soul responds, do good. Let your name be remembered. Eternity now needed to be built in acts, not just in monuments. Even death, which was once a ritual of glory, had become an intimate gesture. Many were buried with just a small statuette, an amulet, a bowl with dry bread. But even so, there was care. The body was washed, the eyes covered with shells, the name whispered, hope preserved. Egypt, even fragmented, never forgot itself, and therefore, even in darkness, it prepared for the return. Not a return to the same forms, the same stones, same pyramids, but a return to essence, to ma'at, to order, to balance. The time of dismemberment, which seemed an end, was only a pause, a deep breath between two acts. Eternity, like the Nile, receded only to return with force, and Egypt, patient as always, waited. There was silence in the north. The ancient capitals were quiet, like old sleeping kings. In Heracleopolis, the palaces became hollow corridors, full of echoes and archives without readers. The Nile still rose and fell, but its cycles no longer obeyed a single voice. The country continued, divided, fractured, and then, in the south, a city rose with slowness, like the sun emerging behind forgotten hills. This city was called Waset, which the Greeks would one day call Thebes. Thebes did not have the hills of Giza, nor the pyramids of Abu Sir, nor the archives of Memphis. It was a city without pomp, but with depth. It was nestled between deserts and palm trees, with an immense sky above it, and the Nile cutting through its heart. And there, between still modest temples and tombs carved into the rock, something new began. Or perhaps something very old. Reconstruction. Egypt was not reunified by quick conquest, but by insistence on order, by persistence of memory, by a faith in Ma'at that had not been forgotten. The first Theban kings of the so-called 11th dynasty were local chiefs, governors with little wealth and almost no army. But they had a clear idea. Unity is not made of walls, but of direction. The most important of them was Mentuhotep II, whose name meant Montu is satisfied, in honor of the warrior god of Thebes. Mentuhotep did not rush north. First, he consolidated the south. He organized the Temple of Karnak, still small, but already sacred. He established alliances. He reinforced the riverbanks. He sent emissaries, caravans, diplomats. His war, when it came, was more of symbols than of blood. He presented himself not as a new king, but as the one who restored what had been broken. His iconography is revealing. In statues, he appears with dark skin, like the god Osiris, seated, rigid, firm, like one emerging from the tomb to restore the world. Upon defeating the lords of the north, he did not humiliate them. He buried them. And with that, he buried an era and raised another. On the stele, the scribes recorded, he united the two lands. He rebuilt the temple of his fathers. He brought peace to the devastated land. And it was true. At last, after generations of uncertainty, Egypt spoke again, with a single voice. But it was not the same voice as before. The new Egypt that emerged was more aware of the world's fragility. The fall had taught humility. Chaos had taught vigilance. The pyramids, once symbols of eternal glory, were no longer built. In their place, the kings dug tombs in the ochre mountains of the western desert, discreet on the outside, vast on the inside. Slowly, the long path to the Valley of the Kings began. These tombs did not shout. They whispered. They were like passages, corridors full of text, of color, of secret. The coffin texts, which had flourished in the previous period, now evolved into the books of the underworld, detailed maps of the soul's journey. because the afterlife was becoming an increasingly complex territory, with regions, portals, judges, monsters, and rewards. Death, now, was a long crossing, and the king was the one who knew the paths. In the temples, the cult deepened. Karnak gained columns. The name of Amun, a once modest local god, began to be repeated with more force. Amun meant the hidden one, he who is not seen. And perhaps that was the clearest sign of Egypt's new phase, a more inward spirituality, more silent, less monumental, more intimate. Amun merged with Ra, becoming Amun-Ra, the supreme god who is, at the same time, light and mystery, presence and absence. Thebes became the city of the invisible. The common people continued with their lives, working, praying, marrying, dreaming. But now, there was a new confidence in the air. The granaries filled again. The canals were dredged. The gods received their offerings. The festivals returned. Chaos receded. The scribes recorded everything with renewed care. They knew that what had been lost could one day disappear again. So, they wrote not only for the gods, but for posterity, so that the world would never again forget what had happened when the heart of Egypt stopped beating. Words became amulets against oblivion. In the scribal schools, apprentices copied ancient phrases with reverence. To be just is eternal. Injustice has no children. Do good. Good endures. The written word is the remedy against time. Each letter a form of resistance. The kings of the 12th dynasty inherit this spirit. Amenemhat I, Senusret, Amenemhat II, and the third. They all governed not with arrogance, but with vigilance. They maintained armies on the borders. They sent expeditions to Sinai, to Nubia, to the western desert. They were engineer kings, shepherd kings, scribe kings. They held back chaos with dikes and decrees. Amenemhat III, soon after assuming the throne, wrote, or had written, a text that circulated for centuries, the instruction of Amenemhat to his son. There, the king speaks of danger, of betrayal, of vigilance, and he ends with a warning. Trust in yourself. No man has allies on the day of misfortune. This was the new lesson. Egypt had been reborn, but it knew that eternity needed to be maintained with effort. The world was no longer something given. It was something built and rebuilt every day. And yet, there was beauty. The Temple of Karnak flourished. Art, Thebanly, refined itself. Popular tales, like the story of the shipwrecked sailor or of Sinuhe, were composed and recited. The Egyptian language reached new maturity. Statues gained delicacy. Paintings explored color and rhythm. It was as if, after everything, Egypt had discovered that the most lasting splendor was not in the heights of the pyramids, but in the depth of the soul. And so, under the immense sky of the south, along the waters of the Nile, a new Egypt flourished, more discreet, more inward, more conscious. An Egypt restored, not only in its temples, but in its heart.